When he came to talk at Athabasca School, he never contacted his own people.
He never seemed to want to be part of home.
He kept to himself. He wouldn't participate, and he was a smart fellow.
The family were viewed as communists.
There were people who viewed Samariga's writings as vulgar and crude.
If he wouldn't communicate with us, are we supposed to chase after him?
He liked to write essays.
I listened to his plays on CBC radio and watched productions of his plays on TV. Some of it was good.
No one in Richmond Park or Athabasca would dispute that George Riga was talented.
He wrote some things people didn't agree with.
Well, he wasn't a right-wing Christian. Some people were in conflict with his ideas.
Why should we listen to him? He is just a ploughboy, like the rest of us.
Keep your feet upon the ground. Though clouds play in your raven hair, and fingers every star ensnare,
for you will lose your buoyant heart when fancy's earth and sky surpass, yet you forget the field of grass. The cynic foes you fight today
forgot the hills and sunlit streams, forgot the people and their dreams. So work as 10.
For you are young, but keep your pen to heavens hurled, reflecting truth within the world. This fella, or George, had to have some type of really unexplainable thoughts in his mind.
Author of 15 stage plays, 9 radio plays, 15 television dramas, 4 films, 4 novels, including Ballad of a Stonepicker, a thinly disguised autobiography of his boyhood in Alberta, also 1 book of nonfiction, 2 books of poetry, 3 oratorios, 2 records, and 1 short story, along with a collection of short stories. The bridge linking the remote farming community of Richmond Park to the town of Athabasca, about 150 kilometers north of Edmonton, Alberta, was completed some 20 years after George Riga's birth in 1932 to poor Ukrainian immigrant farmers.
I think Canada was pretty smart to invite the Ukrainian people to Canada. They farmed in the homeland in Ukraine, and they came here and they developed Canada to the state that it's at today.
Nothing should have grown out of this unforgiving land, but crops were nurtured along, and George Riga, speaking no English until he started school, went on to become a writer of international acclaim.
Whatever field he would have gone into, George would have made a success. And the reason I'm saying this, I think that George himself was a smart individual, and he knew what he wanted in life. He knew how to express it. George was pretty broad-minded, and his actual belief was to support individuals that were not outspoken. You know, he tried to speak for them. Not necessarily that everybody would hear him or pay attention to him, but he was there to try and support the average individual that had, you know, something to contribute to life on earth.
When we were around George, we loved to visit with him because there was no barrier to language or conversation or politics or ideology. There was that freedom you have with somebody who you don't have to be careful about what you say. That's the hope of the future, right? That's the hope of truth and reconciliation.
His play, The Ecstasy of Rita Joe, has appeared in print more than any other Canadian play, described by Talon Books as the seminal Canadian dramatic work. The Ecstasy of Rita Joe has been continually in print since the first edition appeared in 1970. Commissioned by the Vancouver Playhouse Theatre in 1967, The Ecstasy of Rita Joe opened amid festivities marking Canada's centennial. Not everyone was feeling celebratory. A Lament for Confederation, a soliloquy by Chief Dan George, appeared in the program notes for the November 1967 opening. The writer, actor, and commentator appeared in the play, along with Frances Hyland, who played Rita Joe. Based on the story of a young Indigenous woman's ordeal and eventual rape and murder in the big city, The Ecstasy of Rita Joe challenged audiences as it explored a social reality in Canada. In the author's program notes, George Riga wrote that, "The Ecstasy of Rita Joe is the story of people in conflict, struggling at a disadvantage. The issue is the burning issue of our time. People who are forgotten are not forgetting. To overlook them is a dangerous delusion." In 1981, the Winnipeg-based Prairie Theatre Exchange, featuring the critically acclaimed Margot Kane as the first Indigenous Rita Joe, toured its highly successful production to Vancouver's East Cultural Centre. Margot Kane's work in Canadian theatre after Rita Joe has resulted in her being known as the mother of Indigenous theatre in Canada. Margot talks of the impact George Riga's The Ecstasy of Rita Joe has had on her, the voice of Indigenous peoples, and the fabric of our nation.
When we did Rita Joe at the Citadel, it was a chance for me to reconnect in a way that was very precious to me. The voice of our own people needs to be heard, and at that time there was very few voices. But for me, as an young Indigenous woman actor, there were no works to perform in. George was, a well-known writer, yet a struggling writer, struggling to have that voice heard in Canada as well. There are protocols around supporting the inclusion of other voices in that circle. And I do recall that it was a collaboration. I think they were willing to be part of the story because of George and his understanding that there are voices that need to voice the story the way they need to voice the story and to serve that. He resonated with where we're at. The importance of other voices. A lot of that colonial kind of way of being is, they've taken stories and they've changed it and, used that legend to help them tell their story and their perception of the story. But there are other people whose story will never be told unless they support them in helping to tell that story. There was always a sense of inclusion with George, and a sense that is very Indigenous, as I have come to understand, that we need to make room for all those voices. And even if they're not voicing, we need to make room so in case they want to voice, they know they're welcome. We still have not gotten to the point where the funding and the support systems are there for Indigenous voice to be told theatrically. After all this time, people are still wanting to talk about Rita Joe. And I am tired of talking about Rita Joe. I want new work.
In a country whose two largest publicly supported theater festivals were dedicated to the works of dead foreigners, Shakespeare at Stratford and Shaw at Niagara-on-the-Lake, perhaps it was time to consider having a festival also devoted to a Canadian playwright. And arguably, the most important Anglophone Canadian playwright who ever lived and worked was George Riga. The fact that Riga was the first dramatist in Canada to dare to suggest that racism was part of Canada's glorious history meant that the play would upset many people, meant that the play would break new ground thematically. Canadian plays prior to Riga were pretty gentle, were pretty bland. And Riga also broke ground dramaturgically, creating a play with music, a kind of Brechtian, kaleidoscopic anatomization of everything that was wrong with Canada. And the Canadian government was not immediately amused by the use of its money this way.
The things that he wrote, the way he expressed story, the way Chief Dan, who had a huge impact on my life also, I fell in love with the possibility of what the arts can do for culture, for us as human beings. And so here we are today, 50 years later, which I can't believe. And it's as real today as it was then. And that's what really good art should do, and that's what George left us with.
It was George Riga who I think began the dialogue that fostered the current atmosphere of reconciliation and recovery of historical truth on Canadian stages. Riga did that back in the 60s. I suggest that Riga, if he were still with us, would probably be leaving most of that material to Indigenous writers to take forward, and he would be moving into other areas that need a voice. He was decades ahead of most writers in terms of perceptions back then, and I suggest to you that he would be decades ahead today. Riga would have moved on, but what George Riga did and said as part of his own personal history, I think must be remembered.
It's okay to look back a bit, but one thing George Riga taught me, you can never look away. Before the bridge, there was the ferry in the warm months, or the cage, when neither ferry nor ice road could get you to the other side. Richmond Park was another 35 kilometers beyond, a considerable distance on early roads. The bridge opened in 1952, 25 years after Ukrainian immigrant George Riga Sr. arrived in the area. A community builder of Richmond Park, Alex Kravitz, grew up with George Riga.
You know, our parents went into very difficult times, through very difficult times, because of the fact language was a big barrier. It was not easy for me. It wasn't easy for George. We had to try and make the best of what we could afford and what we could get out of our educational system at the time. We started in a one-room school that housed about 50 students, and from there on, we had to be divided by the teacher to try and class the students in that school into groups that would kind of work together and exceed as best they could. And George was a very smart boy, you know, and especially literature and essay and that he just excelled in it very greatly. You might call it supernatural knowledge or wherever he got the wisdom from.
The son of poor Ukrainian farmers showed talent at an early age, encouraged by some of his teachers and Evelyn Rogers, the editor of the Athabasca Echo. In a 1985 interview with CBC Radio's Peter Zowski, George Riga talks about where the words for his early work came from.
So I published some poetry when I was, I think, 12 in the local paper. I hadn't read that widely from what other people had done, so I used the experiences I knew to make up the stories and the poems and eventually the plays.
In 1949, at age 17, George attended the Banff School of Fine Arts on a province-wide scholarship awarded by the Imperial Order Daughters of the Empire. George's talent, combined with his hard work, resulted in him being asked back the following summer. But by fall, George was back working the harvest. It seemed there was no question that George would farm. George Riga talks about another influence, this one close to home, that would later determine the path of his writing.
The Wabasca Reserve was only a short distance away, so the youngsters used to come out and pick roots and stones, which is what I did when I was a youngster. These were my peers, working side by side with them, and they're all gone. So very few of them survive past 30 years of age. You get their life experience by osmosis.
They had a hard time too, their life wasn't easy. Maybe we weren't totally fortunate, and truly enough didn't enjoy all the comfort that there was to be enjoyed in life, but there were less fortunate people than what we were at the time. There was really no jobs available except maybe going in the wintertime to the bush to work in a lumber camp, or else go and try and find some farm work for the different farmers that have had some work available for laborers. In 1950, myself, George Riga, and Eddie Mockett decided to apply for a homestead. There were 2 quarters available. There were 3 of us that were interested in them. So we all 3 went to Edmonton to the Department of Lands and Forests. They put our names in a little strip of paper and put it in a hat. I happened to be the lucky one, I guess, or I don't know if you call it lucky or not. I sure got myself a lot of work when I got the homestead, and I drew number 1. The second draw was, of course, left over. George didn't get the draw, but Eddie Mockett got one.
Perhaps Canadian theatre history is the richer that George Riga lost the land lottery. Not having his own farm led George to take a construction job in 1950 that would forever seal his fate. The new bridge would remove much of the isolation north of the river, including Richmond Park. However, an on-site accident severely damaged George's right hand.
And that's where he lost his fingers. Now, whether he lost 2 or 3 fingers, I'm not sure. I never saw George since that accident of his. But that's where George got, I guess, probably depressed to a certain point, that he said, I've had enough of this. I'm going to look for a future that's going to be more satisfying, because he was a smart boy.
That smart boy went to the big city to write for 2 radio stations, earning money to travel. His acquired global perspective shaped his new worldview. A Canadian literary giant was born. George Riga moved to Summerland, British Columbia from Edmonton in 1963. There George worked with his wife Norma and children until his death in 1987. In Richmond Park, where Riga grew up, the crops grew out of the soil. So did rocks.
And the land, after we seeded it, usually was harrowed, and the harrows would roll out the rocks above the surface of the soil, and we would take pails and go and pick the rocks, and they would be picked up into the rock piles, such as what you see in the photograph here. I tell you, it was pretty hard because there were many a days that I would have to take a bottle of water and I had to have a drink every few minutes because it was quite hot. The eyebrows were dripping with sweat.
Rock piles grew endlessly, monuments to the never-ending struggle.
I was not there in person, but I do know when George's body was cremated, his wish was George wanted to be spread on the rock piles that existed on the Riga farm. So they took his ashes, and there were 5 different rock piles on that quarter section, and they spread some of the ashes on each one of the piles. Now the piles have been buried by the bigger operators that took over the land, and of course his ashes got buried with the rock piles that were on the land.
Luke chapter 4, verse 24. And he said, Verily I say unto you, no prophet is accepted in his own country.
The hand that picks the stones, the hand that writes the stories, is the same hand. The land so full of stones, the land so full of stories, the same land. The boy who picks the stones, the man who pulls the stories, the cries, the tries, the whys, the lies, the grace, and yes, some glory. Na na na, na na na, na 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 na. Some stories push us down, others help us rise like stones and sun. Stones and sun. Some are built on lies, some have work to do that's never done.